Hi, good morning. I'm County Supervisor Joe Simidian, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our fifth annual Data Privacy Day here at Santa Clara County. Today's topic, of course, is artificial intelligence and privacy, forming a responsible and intentional partnership. What that means, I think, is an important topic of our conversation today. Hopefully, we'll learn quite a bit more about how that might take shape, what that looks like in the years ahead. But today, as we all listen and learn, I think we know AI is a topic that is often discussed, but not always well understood. A lot of folks, I think, struggle just to wrap their arms around some of the most basic principles, and I think that's entirely understanding. Even more complex is the question of how AI is going to play a role in a county as large and complex as our own. We have an $11 billion budget. We have more than 20,000 employees. We serve almost 2 million constituents here in a county with 15 different cities and towns. And we handle a lot of sensitive information. We have more than a dozen hospitals and health clinics. We run elections. We collect taxes. Obviously, that means there are lots of functions to be performed, but there are also a lot of opportunities to either get it right or not when it comes to caring for folks' very sensitive personal information. As I said, AI plays a growing role in the world of government, and it is a role I expect will only grow in the years ahead. So I'm glad you're here to help shape that future. I know from my role, 20 years ago as the chair of the Assembly Select Committee on Privacy when I was in the state legislature, later in the state Senate, that these privacy issues are not always top of mind until and unless there's a problem. And of course, then it's too late. So I am so pleased that our county, under now the leadership of Chris Paul, is going to take a forward-looking approach, ask ourselves what's coming our way, how should we be ready for it, and what do the best practices look like as we integrate AI and privacy in a responsible and intentional way. Thanks so much for being here. Now, Chris, over to you. Let's find out what we need to know.
So thank you, Supervisor Simidian, for your remarks. And I'd like to add my own welcome to our fifth annual Data Privacy Day. My name is Chris Paul, and I'm the Chief Privacy Officer for the County of Santa Clara. And thank you for joining us today. I'd like to take a moment to thank Supervisor Simidian for taking time to open today's event. Supervisor Simidian has been a champion of privacy rights during his tenure of serving in the public, including spearheading the creation of the Privacy Office at the county. And we're grateful for his public service and support. However, I would be remiss to also thank those who are behind the scene, whom you will not be seeing today, from our Technical Services and Solutions Department, or also known as TSS, and our Privacy Office team for pulling today's event together and supporting all the efforts that you've seen, that you will see today, and also postings from our website as well too. Their efforts are key to getting us to this moment, and I'm excited that we have 4 expert panelists who you'll meet in a moment who will be educating us about privacy and artificial intelligence and how to form that responsible and intentional partnership. As Supervisor Simidian pointed out, AI's prominence in the workplace and society has increased. In fact, yesterday, on Tuesday, January 24th, the International Association of Privacy Professionals published a privacy and AI governance report, noting that privacy is the key pillar to ethical and responsible AI. Their report anticipates that AI is going to grow by 25% each year for the next 5 years, resulting in a global contribution of about 15 trillion, and that's with a T, to the global economy by 2030. And this is why it's really important that we take pause and understand AI and what that means to ourselves and also in the business context as well. Now, why do we have Data Privacy Day? Many of you have participated in this before. You may be in the industry as well. Some of you are brand new. Data Privacy Day did begin in Europe in 1981 when the first international treaty or Convention 108 was signed to protect individuals' personal rights. Data Privacy Day was first celebrated within the United States in 2008 And in 2014, the United States Senate passed Resolution 33, declaring January 28th as National Data Privacy Day, which this year is on Saturday. I'm sure most of you understand that our data is needed for many different things out there, such as routine transactions, such as maybe maintaining your bank account, accessing government services, purchasing goods or services. However, sometimes you're not sure about the amount of data you're handing over when participating either in a grocery store loyalty program or working on social media or potentially signing up for surveys or contests as well. And at times, unfortunately, our information can be compromised. And that provides the opportunity for bad actors to use that data and to engage in harmful acts such as phishing or trying to hack into our online accounts as well too. So today, Data Privacy Day, or Saturday officially, is an opportunity for each of us to reflect on what information we share, how we actively protect our information, and how information is valuable. Because there's many bad actors out there. And our role today is to educate you on how AI and privacy can work together, both in your personal context and also in a professional setting as well too. So before I introduce the panelists, let me go over what we're going to cover today. I anticipate many of you want to ask our panelists questions. And that's why we've allocated some time at the end of today's session to address your questions. And to ask a question, use the Zoom Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And if we run out of time, or if we run out of time, we will follow up with some of the responses at later time. But we will be addressing as many of your questions as you can. We will be saving it towards the end of the event as well, because I anticipate some of our panelists will be covering some of your questions. But first, I'd like to understand who is with us today. So I'm going to ask for a poll to be opened, and in a moment, you'll see a polling question on your screen, and I'd like you to just take a moment to identify who you are. We will obviously not be able to trace back who you are, but just for us, for our understanding of our audience today too. So while our poll is opening, I want to mention for those of you who are certified members of the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or the Healthcare Compliance Association, you may self-submit 2 continuing education credits by logging into your account, either at the IAPP or the HCCA. Follow those instructions. If you need to download an event flyer as proof of today's event, please navigate out to our Public County of Santa Clara Privacy Office if you need to attach those documents as proof of attending today's event as well. And feel free to download those. We will also include a link to our public website in just a moment too, so you can refer back to that as well too. We also are recording today's event, and we will be posting it on the public website as well, on the public privacy website, and it will be available by the 8th as well too. So let's take a look at our responses. I'm going to ask the polling questions to be displayed. What's interesting, or maybe scary, is 62% of our participants are work in the government sector. And Supervisor Simitian pointed out just the role of AI in the government sector and how we have a responsibility as we use that technology thoughtfully in a manner that benefits our clients as well too. We have 14% in the medical field, which makes perfect sense for AI, and that will continue to play a broader role in some of our services that we provide in the medical setting as well too. And we have a good kind of division between education, finance, and the legal profession as well. And then our second question and our responses there is, how familiar are you with AI? And we have most of our responses are either somewhat or slightly familiar. So the perfect topic for our panelists to help us today with understanding what AI is. And hopefully we can move up that percentage at the end of today's event up into the extremely familiar as well too. And again, I really encourage you to drop those questions in our Q&A as well too, as many of you, including myself, are not experts in the AI field, but we have 4 experts that are going to join us today. So let me go ahead and I'm going to introduce our panel. today, and I'm going to ask our panelists to also help us define what AI is at the end of our introductions. So Merv Hickok is the founder of AIethicist.org, and she provides consultancy and training services to private and public organizations on responsible AI development, use, and government. And she's been recognized by a number of organizations, and most recently as one of the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics in 2021, and runner-up of Responsible AI Leader of the Year in 2022 for Women in AI. Catherine Jasson is a postdoctoral research at the Center for IT and IP Law within the Faculty of Law of Keown-Levin. As a postdoctoral research, she is researching the use of facial recognition technologies in the public space for surveillance purposes and their impact on the rights to privacy and data protection. Her publications cover a broad variety within the privacy sector, such as data protection, privacy, AI, biometrics, intellectual property, and media law topics. And she's also a regular speaker at privacy and technology conferences linked to biometrics technologies. Brenda Leong is the partner of B&H AI, which is a boutique law firm uniquely founded by a partnership between lawyers and data scientists, dedicated entirely to developing policies and procedures around AI governance, including applying models of risk management frameworks, performing model audits, and creating de-identification of architecture and certifications, along with designing and automating AI policies and procedures. And you can see there's a common theme between our three panelists already. And finally, Bertram Leib is a senior policy counsel, data decision-making artificial intelligence at the Future Privacy Forum, where he leads FPF's work on artificial intelligence. His portfolio includes broadband access, media diversity, facial recognition, law enforcement surveillance technologies, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, algorithm bias, artificial intelligence, content moderation, and platform accountability. And again, I really thank our four panelists for taking the time today to really impart AI and to help answer some of those questions I'm sure many of you have about how do we use AI, how do we use it responsibly, what are those policies and procedures and governance around AI. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to have Merv kind of start us off, and we're going to go in the order of how our panelists were listed on our flyer. And like us to baseline, what does AI mean, and how do we define what AI, and if there's anything else we should be aware of as we look at AI from our panelists, and then we'll move out from some questions as from there. So Merv, can you help us kick it off and maybe help us define what AI is, and if there's any other important aspects that we should be keeping in mind through our discussion today?
Thank you, Chris. First of all, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here and really honored to be here today. I can take up the whole 2 hours trying to define AI, to be honest, or like open it up to discussion, but I'll briefly rephrase OECD's definition and maybe start with actually what AI is not. It's not the Terminator. It's not the the villain robot bringing the end of the world. It is the ubiquitous software that is using a lot of big data with a given set of objectives to create a model using that data and provide outcomes. And then those outcomes influence our decisions, the environment. So it might be predictions, it might be categorizations, scoring, etc. But at the end of the day, it really is software and maybe advanced software in that.
Great. Catherine, how would you add to that conversation as well, just defining what AI is and its uses?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the conference. So actually, I have a perspective from a legal perspective and European perspective as well. So I think it would be very interesting to compare US and EU perspectives on this topic. When I was thinking about defining AI, what you see in abstract is that AI could mean mimicking or replicating human intelligence, but it's not what it is. From a legal perspective, what is very important is to understand actually the impact that AI system that are automatizing tasks that human beings are doing, which kind of impact it could have on these human beings. So for me, it's more systems that are using, that are performing tasks that we could do, and which kind of impact this could have on us, on individuals or society.
That's interesting, and we'll probably tease that thread a little bit more between European privacy rights and here in the United States as well too. Brenda, how I'd like to get your input on just AI uses, definitions, and any other important aspects we should remember today.
Thanks. I echo the thanks for being here today and the opportunity to talk about this very interesting subject. I would just sort of point out in the common understanding of AI, or sort of popular understanding, how we keep sort of upping the bar on what is AI. Things that are legitimately artificial intelligence in a more traditional sense are sort of almost old hat now that we have machine learning, which is just, you know, one of the more recent iterations of artificial intelligence. And even now that's being eclipsed by things like generative AI, doing chat GPT and these kind of content generation things, as opposed to just pattern analysis and outputs. So I would say that, you know, without repeating what have already been two very good definitions of it, it's also interesting to just consider what it means in people's common, including our common understanding of it. We sort of keep moving the bar. The more it can do, the more impressive it has to be for it to really seem like actual AI to us, as opposed to just, oh, some computer program that, you know, we're used to gaming, we're used to these natural language translators and things like that now. Now that, what have you done for me lately? So just would point that out.
Sure. No, thank you. And Bertram, I think from your interactions at the Future Privacy Forum, you probably deal with AI and machine learning a lot, but love to get your input on how you define AI and its use, or any other important aspects we should keep in mind.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. One slight correction on my bio: I no longer cover all of those issues. That was my previous job at Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, where I worked with the civil rights community on a variety of tech and telecom issues. But that correction aside and that gratitude aside, I think I'm going to couch a definition from Brenda, actually, when she was, as Brenda previously directed AI work at Future Privacy Forum, that I think is a brilliant way of understanding AI, and it's a simple definition. AI is generally understood to be a field of computer science focused on designing systems using algorithmic techniques, somewhat inspired by the knowledge of the human brain, and capable of performing tasks that, if performed by a human, would be said to require intelligence. Brenda's brilliance is, she casts a long shadow, and it's a very, very big shoes to fill. But that's, I think, the best definition of AI that I've heard yet. Right, because it includes all of the things that we've talked about on this panel, but also can encapsulate more. AI is, we all struggle to define AI because of the complexity of the systems, but ultimately it's a field, and it has an exponential expanse.
No, I appreciate that. And I think I appreciate also saying that the definition is also ambiguous as well. It was something I was personally struggling with about what AI is. And I appreciate Brenda kind of saying there's multiple generations out there. We're moving to machine learning, you know, chat GPT is out there, and AI continues to be used in a greater and greater context, and even in a more powerful context. I'd like to hear, you know, Catherine, I know you are in Europe and you deal with European privacy laws, and understanding how AI should be used responsibly, not only just to comply with laws, but what's the best use for AI. And particularly, I think we should probably pick up on bias, because as Bertrand identified, is software is developed by humans. Humans naturally have bias as well. So how do we ensure that when we're using AI in the European context, what are some of the key things that we should be aware of? And then I'd like to get your thoughts secondarily on just bias and how will we pull bias out of some of these algorithms.
So this topic about bias and artificial intelligence is a very hot topic currently in Europe. And the question is how you tackle it. I have to say that it comes very important in Europe through research that was done in the United States first, where and in biometric field, but not only. The researcher first thought that you could tackle the issue of bias just by a quick fix, technical fix. But that's not the case, of course, because you have all these societal biases or cultural biases that are embedded in everyone. And the question is, how do you tackle these biases? How you are aware of the fact that you have biases? I think you should take context when you develop an AI system and you want to design it for a specific system, sorry, for a specific purpose, you should take the context of use of this system and whether you are building some assumption in the system. Because of course you could say if you have a diversity in the training data set, this is currently what we have as discussion, huh? That you will be able to have less biases in your data set, but that's not sufficient. So I think it's about the assumption that you have. I cannot tell you that we have found the solution for that. It's just by having diversity as well in the teams, in the data scientists that are in charge of these systems. You should have a variety of data scientists representing as well different ethnicities or individuals who have disabilities, you know, things that you will maybe not think of to be able to create a fair systems. Beside that, it's a topic that we will have in the sense that to make sure that a system is fair, you have to make sure that you don't have biases. But as I say, it's not a technical issue. It goes much beyond technical issues.
I appreciate that. I mean, going, not throwing it over to your technical teams to tell them to fix the bias, but really, how do you prevent the bias up front? And I think that kind of goes into building out kind of that moral framework out there. And maybe I can ask Brenda or even Merv about, kind of carrying on to Catherine's theme about having diversity and really pulling out the bias at the beginning. What are some of the other techniques we can do to just recognize bias, remove bias, include diversity, pressure tests? How will we build out that framework? Maybe I can ask Brenda to go first and now Merv go second.
I mean, I would say, first of all, it's important to understand that there is no such thing as pulling out all of the bias or having data that's not biased. All decisions that you make about what data to collect, which things to weight in your system, those are all creating bias. Those are all establishing bias in how you are using your machine learning system to do what it's supposed to do. But obviously I'm not trying to pretend I don't understand the point, which is to have undesirable bias or illegal bias in your output. And so that's one of the ways to review it is, to start with an understanding of what your end game is and collect data that will, in the best of your planning ability, meet that. So that, for example, we know that in the past, facial recognition systems or other systems that were designed overwhelmingly on one particular gender or race or demographic didn't work well on others. And now we know that that's a thing to ask when we start. But then we also would continue to monitor the outputs of a system. If it's an employment and it's an applicant screening program, are we getting rankings across either those protected classes like demographics of output, or it could be other measures that a business particularly needs, and it can measure those outputs to see, are they coming out in the distribution that is expected, that is needed, that is legally required, whatever that might be. So that's certainly one of the ways, or a combination of the ways to consider building and monitoring systems.
Great, thank you. And Merv, how would you help us out on this question?
And if I can continue with both great suggestions and comments, I think bias also comes in from the very beginning in terms of making a decision to use an AI system in the first place. So when we start, when you have AI and want to use AI, it becomes a hammer when you're like hitting all the problems that you have around you, or you're creating problems that you could possibly apply your system. I would say looking at the context and looking at the history of whatever it is that you're trying to solve, looking, especially when it comes to societal problems, or looking at AI systems where we try to solve societal problems, there are serious structural issues and a lot of histories of inequities and discrimination in a lot of those societal issues. Take it from voting to housing to credit to employment, you name it. So without understanding the context, without understanding the history of the problem and who was involved, who was not involved, how the data might be skewed, and whether AI should be a solution in the first place, I think everything else is the technical, like you already made up your mind and you're trying to course correct. But let's consider that AI might be a solution to the problem that you have. Following on the two comments, there are a number of technical, how do you say, and context-driven solutions that you can use. Anything from, data analysis, data governance, good data practices, where you're getting your data, how you're getting your data, how you're collecting. Is it representative? Is your team representative? How are you measuring success of your AI system? How are you monitoring your system? And how are you creating feedback mechanisms with the people or with the constituencies that your AI system is making decisions about? And obviously, looking at it holistically, but for me, the fundamental question is, should you be using it, and understand the history of the question.
And that's an interesting point, is the issue of should we be using it? And that's obviously broader than the Privacy Office. The Privacy Office can certainly sponsor and push that out, but you need your coalition of people from your data governance or information governance areas, definitely your attorneys in here as well too, and just the leadership to understand what the impact is of making decisions using artificial intelligence or machine learning, and understanding the impacts, and the results of those impacts would be as well. There's obviously, as we appreciate, organizations need automation to get some work done, but then what's that impact to the individual at the end of the day, and making sure that it's fair. And I'd like to, maybe pull in Bertram in this discussion. There's a very interesting question that's been asked by one of our audience members about artificial intelligence that, as we've identified, is programmed and coded by individuals who come from their own biases. And we've learned a few things about how we try to avoid biases as well too. But what are some of maybe the risk or the legal ramifications that we should be considering when we look at bias or AI, and then how it impacts an individual? What framework or questions should we be asking?
So I think there are a couple things that folks should be thinking about, particularly from the perspective of government. One big one is Title VI. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act mandates that any federal dollars that are used cannot be used in a discriminatory fashion, and any programs that touch it. And so there's a long, robust history, and like the history behind it is, I think, really important, right? This was during this law was enacted during the Civil Rights Movement. One of the fastest ways in order to grow your business is to get government contracts. And so denying government contracts to marginalized communities was common. And so there is a law in place to ensure that federal dollars cannot be used in a discriminatory fashion. There are also a number of state laws that also carry this as well. I'm not as familiar with all of the state laws or California's, for example, but I imagine that those state laws still track, and that there are state laws that do the same, particularly in California. But that's important because as government entities, you all have liabilities that private sector entities don't, and don't also account for in the design and the implementation and the testing behind artificial intelligence systems. And I think that is critical to understand from a liability perspective. and from a design perspective. Now, from a use case perspective, it becomes even more contentious, right? Depending on the use case of an artificial intelligence system, you're building into the system. In order to train artificial intelligence, you need millions, billions of data points, right? In order to train it effectively in a lot of circumstances. A lot of the time, that means going back into historical archives and using historical context in order to effectuate like present day decisions. And those two things don't always match up. The context and the kind of like the breakdown of the state or of the county is very different now than it was even when I was born in 1989, right? So particularly in California is what, almost half or 40% Latino at this point. And that is very different than even when I was growing up in the early 2000s, right? And so those contexts are important because your system is going to be designed and implemented in order to kind of understand historical patterns, but not kind of take into account present day values and present day ethics. And also, you know, to be completely honest, not take into account kind of civil rights of marginalized and multi-marginalized communities, right? For example, sexual orientation, for example, has changed drastically, even in the last 10 years, right? How we consider sexual orientation as a protected class has changed dramatically. The context for religion has changed, right? In the early 2000s, for example, 9/11 was happening. And so, for example, Muslims were discriminated against in very, very, very serious ways, particularly across the nation, right? And so things have changed drastically. And we want more inclusion. We want people to have a fair chance because it also alleviates the pain on the local counties. It alleviates pain on government. The more people who can get access to things helps the broader system. You have a bigger tax base. You have more people who can access more opportunities, create more jobs, start new small businesses, right? Get loans, for example. You can build in all of these structures. And so if you're not careful, the liability for a state or locality becomes exponential when you're not checking your systems for bias and you're not engaging in patterns and practices that take into account like some of the liabilities that may occur. And I don't think private entities have done a good enough job of like understanding that. That's new to like this information would be new to unfortunately, a lot of industry. But this is, I think, a context that I think folks need to be reminded of in this context that I think folks should be aware of, particularly at the government level.
No, I appreciate that, Bertram. And maybe I can go back to Catherine on this question. Taking what Bertram said and understanding that protected classes change over time, demographics change as well, and even people's perceptions of different protected classes change. How do we continuously reset the use of the tool to assure that bias doesn't inadvertently get introduced as different political or geopolitical events play out?
This is a very tough question, I would say, that you're asking. And I think it goes beyond the legal implication of biases as well. If I can also build on what Bertram said, I think that from a new perspective, we will also have this issue of discrimination and liability. If you are actually building a system that are biased or that are reproducing biases. No, I don't know if I can say more than what Bertram said actually, but we will not have the same references, we will not have the same legal references, but we have a fundamental right not to be subject to discrimination in Europe. So and with that, I would like to make actually to give a precision concerning data protection and privacy. In Europe, the right to data protection and the right to privacy, they are fundamental rights. So based on that, it means that you are not allowed to process whatever you want for whichever purposes as well. So this is very important. And the regulation that is currently discussed on artificial intelligence is not adopted yet. It's a proposal which is currently discussed. It's also building on the fundamental rights. And it's about regulating the negative impact that AI system can pose to individuals from a safety perspective, or from a human rights perspective. So I think this is very important. But on biases specifically, I don't think that I can add more than what was said before.
I appreciate that. I know it is a very tough question that I threw out there as well too, but I think this is where this is leading us is really into AI ethics, which I know, Merv, you have published multiple journals on this topic as well, and the use of AI and how information is collected, used, stored, shared, and so forth. Maybe you can help us based on your experiences about how do we use AI ethics to benefit marginalized communities, and maybe also any studies or research that you've found that actually promotes the benefits of AI in the communities as well.
Oh, thank you for that. And let me first tackle the first part of it. Yes, I've written a lot about the published principles and have been reading, writing and talking about these principles. I will say that with a caveat though, that you have 200 plus maybe principles right now. I tend to look at the practice, principle versus practice, because there are two ways that you can go about these principles, especially if you're a private organization. One, you can say that, okay, here's our principles, ethical AI or responsible AI principles, and we're going to align our products, our services, our culture accordingly. It will be aligned with our values, our contracts, our business model, etc. Or you can look at your actual practices and define the principles according to your current practices, which means that it becomes a PR activity that is not forcing you to change any behavior, any business model, etc. So you can have best of both worlds. Have your responsible AI, ethical AI principles, or whatever it is, and then keep on doing whatever that biased or discriminatory services or products that you have, no regard with privacy, etc. When we look at the principles, coming back to the principles, and are we inclusive in our approach in AI ethics and in principles? One of the things that I've been looking at and published is like, whose principles are these? Whose ethics are we talking about? And given the cross-border nature or borderless nature of these systems, a lot of the principles are converging on Western cultures, and within those cultures, the dominant groups within those cultures. So you're hearing more of the same principles, more of the same concepts, and not necessarily alternative experiences or alternative perspectives. And this connects, directly with what you mentioned on barriers to marginalized groups and what they face. Because as a consequence of not being at the table, as a consequence of their perspectives and experiences not being included in these discussions with extra barriers, we're actually widening that gap of haves and have-nots, those who decide and those who are subject to decisions. So we definitely need to do a better job globally, a better job of being more inclusive. Some of the actions that we do, for example, or any organization can do, providing opportunities for researchers and civil society organizations in meaningful ways. For example, you can start a training or a conference opportunity, but should not expect for groups to show up, by themselves, or wonder why people are not, showing up. We need to be asking questions about those barriers. Can they afford travel? Do they have visa complications? Should this be in person in the first place? Do they have reliable broadband to access if it's virtual? Do they have people writing reference letters if they're academics? Do they have people sponsoring them for future opportunities? Is your organization going the extra mile to reach the communities who don't have these opportunities in the first place? In addition to being the founder of AIethicists.org, I'm the research director and chair for Center for AI and Digital Policy. We, for example, hold ourselves accountable very critically to do this, and we, as a global nonprofit organization, we run semester-long free virtual AI policy clinics, AI policy education, and we determined that this needs to be virtual. This needs to be free, even if it means that we're putting funds in or we're scaling back on other stuff that we would like to do, and go the extra mile to reach communities around the world where there are not many of these training opportunities or employment opportunities. So we now have representation over 60 countries around the world in our classes.
Wow.
And we've been running this semester-long stuff. But if you don't ask those questions about the barriers and hold yourself accountable to solve them, then we're just going to be hearing the same people again and again.
And it's very interesting. I've never thought of the questions you had regarding accessibility, either from the ability to make it to a conference, how the conference is held, or even the ability to participate virtually, because many people do not have access to broadband or cannot afford broadband access as well. So those are really good questions I'm going to keep in mind as well as we continue some of our work here at the county. But I received a very interesting question, I think, along the lines of accessibility for disability, and how do we assure those that are also in a protected class because they have a disability? How do we assure equity within AI design and barriers? And maybe Brenda, I can ask you to help kick off this question.
Sorry, I always got to remember the unmute there. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and an important one as one of the sort of protected classes that sometimes doesn't get as much attention or doesn't get as much headline as race and gender and religion even will sometimes get, but is obviously a critically important one for full value to all members of our communities and our society. And I mean, one of the things is that AI is making accessibility possible in some ways for some of these groups. We have, the development of voice technologies now where, you can interact verbally with things. So if you have a physical disability that makes a keyboard or a mouse difficult, or if you are, have educational or language challenges where reading something or typing things up is more difficult. So it definitely opens up some opportunities for things like that in many ways. But of course, always just carry the risk of overlooking some of those communities as well. The EEOC has recently put out some guidance in conjunction with the Department of Justice about exactly this concern, that in using automated decision-making systems, for example, for employment applicant screening of resumes or things like that, that people with disabilities are going to be, I'm going to use this word cautiously, but inadvertently left out, which the whole point is they need to be intentionally included and intentionally focused on not letting them be discluded. But the point is it isn't intentional in the system, but because of the nature of indicate what accommodations you might need to do this job or things like that, it puts more of the burden on the applicant or the person sometimes to navigate the system and find ways to both communicate and then be supported in their disability for jobs they can do and are well qualified and well capable of doing. And so considering that sort of context or situation is really important in both the design and then the operation and oversight of those systems, because you won't necessarily even see that coming out. They will just not be screened into the next stages of the applicant reviews if they are not able to access or respond to, or if the needs that they're need to be able to communicate aren't reflected in the data that's even being collected for the review of that process. So Definitely a really important question, which again has the opportunity to be better supportive in many contexts of certain cases, but carries a lot of risk as well.
Definitely. And obviously, this is a pretty complex area. Between the four of you have identified multiple things that we all have to keep in mind. And so, this requires experts and thoughtful responses about how do we deal with marginalized communities in the larger sense, but also how do we use it for fairness, which is really a difficult thing to do and appears to be something that's ongoing that we need to consider. But also, if you think about in our poll results, we had a good number of people from the healthcare sector, and in the healthcare sector, like technology continues to move and continues to grow, but also there's ethical concerns within the healthcare industry and how we're developing different outcomes. But how can AI actually be used for the good within the healthcare sector, and maybe what are some of the areas we should be concerned about? And maybe it's more along the lines of equitable access to resources with AI. And maybe Bertram, I can maybe kick us off on the kind of AI and healthcare uses, and maybe open it up to the rest of our panelists as well.
So I think AI, for example, was a really helpful tool in the beginning of the pandemic to help kind of like codify COVID spread and where it was likely to spread, and trying to protect communities in the early days of the pandemic. But I think the context matters and the use case matters. So, for example, still to this day, in a lot of medical textbooks, there is I don't know how to put this, how to say this nicely, but I'll try. Disproportionately, Black people, and particularly Black women, are seen to be able to accept more pain than anybody else, right? And that's like in medical textbooks and nursing textbooks and like all of those things. And it's completely false. It's based on all sorts of like horrible and like racist tropes that have carried into the medical field even to this day. I think there was recently something online that showed that line is still there in like currently used nursing textbooks, and it's wrong, right? But if the data is used in context, so if you're using an AI system, for example, in a healthcare facility, in a hospital facility, and you're trying to mitigate pain, right? And so as you're moving, as you're moving through kind of like how to think about AI use in the healthcare field, you have to take into account historical like racist tropes, as we're being completely honest about that, and based on like tropes that are based in eugenics, right? That have no real connection to reality or to the real world, but these were how the people who started the medical field thought these things through, which has been proven false, but like is still part of the science. And so you can see that there. And so when you're talking about use cases in healthcare, there's a ton of good that can come from it, right? Cancer detection, imaging, it's faster than people. And when combined with a doctor, it could save people's lives. But at the same time, you have to take into account the use case, right? You have to take into account the context and the larger context that the medical field is in this circumstance and how it has evolved. And so I think that is something that like, when we're talking about healthcare and AI, and also we haven't even talked about, is it HIPAA covered? Is it considered sensitive data in California? That gets really complicated really quick. My other colleagues at FPF are much better about talking about health data than I am. But that's important to keep in mind too. Like, what is considered sensitive? How do we treat that information? How do we make sure that that information is protected and not just available out into the world, but also how do we use it to be able to actually maybe help build out and help bridge those health disparities in particular communities, to kind of bridge healthcare deserts, to look to provide services to communities that don't have them. Maybe language access is the issue. Maybe actual facilities are the issue. Maybe there are particular spots inside of counties, for example, that have disproportionate healthcare outcomes that AI can help identify and maybe even solve, right? But like, we have to think about the use. And so when I think about AI, I think about the two things. A lot of people talk about ethics, a lot of people talk about transparency, but I think about context, use, an already current law, right?
Mhm,
Under the ACA, there is a non-discrimination provision under the Affordable Care Act, right? Somebody recently asked me in the Q&A to cite the exact law, and so I'm gonna go back in my computer and cite that as well to kind of like help people. But I think there are provisions that require non-discrimination, but also in this context, right? You're trying to ensure that communities have access to things and expanding access, not necessarily using it in a discriminatory fashion, which again puts up liability to the actual county, to the local government at a time when local government needs as much funds as it can to help as many people as it can.
I appreciate that. And let me open it up to the rest of the panelists. What guidelines should we be thinking about in the context of care and healthcare, whether it's in the hospital, whether it's in a home health center? How can we use AI, but what are some of the guidelines we need to follow? And I'll open that up to anyone in our panel.
Let me just make one brief comment to start, and then I'd love to hear what the other panelists say too, which is one thing that's really important to remember, and we've sort of implied this today, but to just state it, everything that you're doing with AI is still subject to all of the laws. Like it doesn't operate in a free space. We're not in limbo or in some Wild West because we are now using an automated system of whatever kind to do a task. So all of these things that we are talking about are very highly regulated spaces with a lot of rules and requirements already. And so the first important step, like Merv said, the first question is, do we need AI to do the job? And then the second question is, if we're going to do it with AI, can we comply with all of the laws that already occur, that we already know that we're subject to? So, patient care equity, access requirements, disability provisions, anti-discrimination laws, all of those things still apply. And throwing an AI system into the middle of the mix does not change that at all. So I would just put that out there as like the baseline. Obviously, there may be new questions that arise and new implications that we might need additional controls for, but there always seems to be that sort of like, it's AI, what happens? It's all sort of a free-for-all. And that is not at all the case in any of these contexts.
I appreciate that. Merv or Catherine?
Yes. Actually, I would like to react because I agree with Brenda. You have to take into account the other laws that are already existing. And from a European perspective, health data, they are sensitive data. So you cannot process them the way you would like. You need to have a specific legal ground for that. So that's one point. And maybe the second one is, since the AI regulation that is currently under development is just a complementary regulation, it focuses mainly on medical devices. But I don't want to say that my knowledge is exhaustive on this, but it's from a liability perspective that it's approached as well. So it's another issue, the medical devices and AI that I think was not mentioned so far. But from what I know is, during the negotiation of this act, the members of the parliament, they are not happy that there is not much discussion on healthcare and AI. But the proposal that we have is a horizontal proposal, so across all sectors. It's like the GDPR again, an omnibus regulation that will not cover everything in the end.
Yeah.
But once again, I'm not the expert on health, and that's a topic that is very specific, with also specific regulations in the EU.
Great.
And I want to tackle the question in very briefly in two angles. One is the existing regulations. Yes, there are just regulations around anti-discrimination, equality. We have HIPAA, etc. But there is a huge gray space or space that people tend to consider as gray. That where health, especially things like health apps or location data that relates to health, or consumption data that relates to health, etc., are falling between the cracks of regulation. So something for us to keep in mind, and FDA is both FTC and FDA as it relates to medical AI-driven medical devices are putting some guidelines and regulations around this. So there's more to see on that one, but there's definitely a space that is not clearly defined or monitored. And regarding your question about how to do this, especially when it comes to health-related AI systems, how to do this better. There was a brilliant study by Ziad Obermeyer and his team a few years ago on racial bias and dissecting racial bias in this commercial software, AI-driven software, where the researchers found that the software was significantly deprioritizing Black patients who had similar health issues to white patients. So you have the same issues, it's prioritizing white patients over Black patients, and they work to improve that algorithm, publish their studies, work with the commercial providers, to which extent we don't know. But me and a number of researchers, we put this as a case study on how to do this. How could both the commercial provider and the hospital system and the doctors, everyone involved in this ecosystem could have done this better, and kind of walk through it as a case study, and happy to share the links of that later.
Sure, please.
But it was picked up by a number of senators, the research, Obermeyer's research, and the results were picked up by a number of senators in the Congress. It is picked up by California AG, as it is an issue being looked at. So I think we need more focus on both the governance, but clearing out those gray spaces. And I totally agree with Bertram in terms of eugenics and discriminatory histories finding their ways into this AI systems if we don't know what we're doing. There's still a number of AI systems and medical calculations that factor in race, which end up, whether it's like kidney functions or other stuff that find their wall space into the systems. We have bias in healthcare systems or health systems, for example, not recognizing non-white skin properly in terms of skin conditions or other manifestations of different diseases. So I think we need to make it this if we keep calling this bias over and over again, it is a very soft term. There should be a point where we start calling it discrimination, because it's not unforeseen or it's not unintended anymore. We have seen reoccurrence again and again.
No, and that's true as well too. And I appreciate calling that out. Is at what point do you think about moving bias to discrimination as well too? The other thing too is I want to start talking a little bit more about how do we use AI in the context of data protection, cybersecurity, national security as well. And this is a great question that was asked by one of our listeners today, is how can AI be used for counterintelligence in regards to preventing a data breach and further enhancing just the data privacy work or the data governance work that many of you are involved, many of our listeners are probably involved in today. Maybe Brenda maybe you can help us with that counterintelligence, as we put in quotes, but how do we use AI to start identifying maybe there's a risk before that risk actually occurs?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. There's a lot in that question. And I'm not actually sure if they mean counterintelligence in terms of like national security kind of counterintelligence, or just like AI attacks on AI systems or attacks on AI systems, because it is also true fundamentally that there are types of attacks on AI systems that are significantly different than a traditional breach. You don't have to actually get access to either the data or the AI system to attack the system. There are a lot of threats you can pose by understanding how the model works or what kinds of data it uses, and doing something called poisoning, doing something called model extraction, membership inferences, which is that you can determine if somebody was in a data set or even some of their personal data just by knowing how the system works. So in terms of that, there are unique and aspects of attack and defense for machine learning based systems that do not apply even under traditional computer security. And the answer to, can AI be used to engage with that? Of course, the answer is yes. AI to fight AI, so to speak, or to prevent access is can be a key aspect of that. So I could talk more, but I'm sure other people have thoughts too. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Maybe Catherine, I can ask you, because in Europe, there are different employee rights and citizen rights than we have in the United States. But, how do we look at AI, maybe, looking at behavioral patterns or other things to help prevent bad things from happening in our networks?
Well, you test your system, and that's one of the obligations that you have as well. It's not necessarily a specific obligation that you will have. However, I want to say that beside this AI Act that is currently under development, there are a lot of initiatives regarding cybersecurity. So, and this initiative, they have to be taken into account. We have a Cyber Resilience Act. There is a new Network Information Security Directive as well that has been adopted. So to have a broad overview of all these obligations, you would have to review all these different instruments. At the end of the day, the issue, it's an issue of cybersecurity as well. And I know that when we prepared this panel, that was one of the questions, and I was thinking, actually, one of the advice that you could give to companies is also to hire hackers to make sure that they can test their system and test their system the way they will be hacked. And in the field of biometric technologies, we see that these attacks, they are more and more refined. And that researchers that are working on that, they can also work for governments or for governmental agencies, because that might be the best way to protect your system as well, by trying to find how they will be attacked.
And Chris, if I can add to this. So the fraud alerts that we get on our card sometimes when we make a purchase or somebody else is using our card, a lot of that's AI. National security, for example, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, for example, use AI all the time to help try and figure out something weird is happening. And law enforcement agencies are using AI as well. They are trying, this is contentious, and, there are clear Fourth Amendment issues, but we don't have to get into those. But, they'll look at, one example was that there was a, how do I frame this correctly? There was a law enforcement agency operating in an area, and there was higher traffic, much higher traffic than usual in a particular space or in a particular area. And they thought that was weird. And it ended up being an arrest from that kind of like data set of like people were building a tunnel into somewhere, right? And they highlighted that just by looking at kind of like the traffic and like use that data in order to kind of like get access and to kind of like highlight major issues in that space. And so it already is used in counterintelligence. It already is used in fraud protection. But on the flip side, it gets really, you have to make sure you're using it in the right use case. For example, I think it was the European context, and this happened in the EU somewhere. I can't remember the country. My apologies in advance. But an AI system was used to look at who was engaging in fraud, in like government service fraud or like social services fraud. And it disproportionately targeted marginalized and multi-marginalized communities, in particular Black folk in this country. And it was proven to be unsuccessful because once those fraud claims were actually interrogated, those fraud claims didn't actually happen. We saw something similar actually with PPP loans, right? And so there's, depending on how you use it, you have to make sure that you are being very particular about what it's doing, right? If you're using it in order to help identify possible, right, areas, that's one thing. But when you're allowing that system to make independent decisions, particularly around social services and government services, again, we're talking Title VI because counties usually get these monies from the federal government. But then also you're talking about, hey, these might be illegal and create a whole bunch of legal liability for the government entity in and of itself if used incorrectly. And so being able to trust but verify, right? And mostly, and verify twice. And so, just like when you're building something, like measure twice, cut once, I think that's how we should be really thinking about using artificial intelligence, particularly in government, because of the equities involved there.
I
So
appreciate it.
maybe I could just add something, because Bertram, actually, the case that you are referring to happened in the Netherlands, and it forced the Dutch government to resign. It's called the Siri. It's a system that has been used to detect fraud, and it was shown that the system was biased because they targeted people with low income who had either dual citizenship or were from foreign origins. But what is surprising is that the Dutch government, of course, is saying that they don't use anymore the system, but it seems that some municipalities are still using the system, or a system close to this system, to allocate subsidies. And what we see each time is that you target vulnerable people as well, because they had to, when we talk about harm caused by AI system, they had to pay thousands of euros back that they receive unfairly. And some people lost their job. There were a lot of consequences linked actually to this AI system that were badly built.
And I think that's interesting. And now we're turning into more of a law, or what should we be doing? I think Brenda said it well, is you can't just throw up your hands and say, or close your eyes and say there are no laws. There are laws out there and that we need to follow as well too, along with many companies and governmental agencies have procedures and processes we need to follow to look at risk. If we were talking to a lawmakers somewhere in the world, how would you describe what makes a good AI law, and how do we balance the need to force companies to do something versus voluntary compliance? How do we maybe encourage people, like Brenda said a little bit earlier, to follow the law? So let's talk about what makes a good AI law, and how do we encourage companies, organizations that are using AI to voluntarily comply with best practices? Maybe I can start with Brenda, since you kind of opened up the subject. Maybe I come back to you on it and then go back to our panelists.
Sure. Well, I actually just answered one of the questions in the Q&A on this, which I think was similar, which is, as an example, this is not an endorsement of this is the be all end all, but as a really good example is actually tomorrow, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as part of the Department of Commerce, is releasing a AI risk management framework, which is literally this. It is a governance structure, and it goes down to a very detailed level. The risk management framework is pretty specific, but still at a broad level. And then they're providing detailed, so they call it their playbook, detailed routines and guides for how to implement this at a very detailed level, as could be applied in many industries or many contexts. And it's a risk-based framework, which aligns very much with the EU AI Act, which is in the process of becoming law. And all of those basically say that the way we need to govern this is based on the risk of the system and the data that it uses, or the impact that it has on individuals because of what the system does. So higher risk systems need to be developed and assessed more carefully, monitored more carefully, and the penalties for not doing that need to be more severe. And some of those, particularly in the countries that have these comprehensive laws already proposed, that's up to 3 or 4% of a company's worldwide revenue or national revenue in some cases. So we're not talking about inconsequential amounts of money here for fines, and that's a pretty good incentive for companies to want to do it, as well as the PR aspects and the hopefully good faith aspects that they would like to not do these bad things. But most of the laws that we're seeing around the world focus on AI, adopt some version of this sort of risk-based framework, determine what the risks of your system are. Do they deal with individual data? Do they have impacts on individual people or groups in a very direct way, whether it's protected areas like housing and finance and employment, or maybe in some other important way. And if so, then you have an extra duty of care, so to speak, to develop, train, analyze and monitor those systems to make sure that they're performing as you expect and as people are relying on them to do, and then have very significant enforcement for that when it's found that that's not to be the case. So that would be a starting point, is some of those risk frameworks.
I appreciate that. We'll also make sure that we get a link out to everyone as well too on the NIST AI framework that's coming out. Maybe Murph, I know you've done a lot of work in this area. What does a good AI law, regulation, or even internal policy look like?
We are actively involved in the conversations on Council of Europe AI Convention, what is to be the first global convention on AI. Similarly with EU AI Act, as well as some of the regulations here in US. For us, it is at this point very clear that some of the voluntary frameworks left with companies, even states, public and private, if it's voluntary, then you're left to the devices of the organization. And that doesn't necessarily always in the benefit of consumers or citizens or people, the society in general. So we base our arguments, we base our advocacy on fundamental rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and global conventions like Convention 108 plus, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Convention on People with Disabilities, Convention on People on the Move, migration related systems, and kind of put it on the states to accept that responsibility to align the domestic laws, be subject to this international and supranational conventions, and then align their domestic laws accordingly, so that we're not discriminating, so that we're respecting Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or in EU's case, fundamental rights, or the EU Charter. So taking the inalienable rights as the basis, and then go about, how can we protect those? How can we nourish those, and not leave it to the voluntary acceptance of certain guidelines? And I'll leave it at that. I know Bertram is.
Chris, I really want to jump in here because I think it's a really powerful point for the folks on this call and for folks who work in local government. You can be a part of the solution. And I think that there's a lot of feeling in local government that you can't, that everything is effectuated, right? That the larger federal, state, and kind of systems are there, but like actually there's a unique opportunity for local government to lead, because you all are paying these people for these services. Thus, you can require them in contract to do certain things in order to lower your liability. This is standard practice in like a ton of different industries across local government. Local government can require the AI systems that it purchases and uses to go through certain steps, to prove certain things, to engage in transparency, to be tested for potential bias, particularly in the area that they're using them in. To go through and say, have requirements about standards, right? That every AI system that it uses must go through the new NIST, as Brenda said, risk management framework, right? Like these are things that can be required of these systems. These are things that can be required of the vendors that you use, because in particularly, I was around for 08, 09, and I saw this, when the economy moves down, government dollars come at a premium. And so you have leverage in this moment, because people want to work with local governments because of the dollars that are connected to them. You can then require, say, hey, if you want to work with us, you must also make sure that we are not in violation of our legal obligations, right? And working with general counsel in order to think through what are some of the requirements, what are some of the best practices, what are areas and localities that have done it well? Are you compliant with what standards not only are in the CCPA or CPRA, but also are you engaged in the best standards and best practices that are happening globally, so that you can engage in like multi-stakeholder, multi kind of or global kind of commerce within the context of these systems. Like, there is an opportunity for localities to think through these systems and think through what those requirements would be, right? And this is also in a space where industry can also come in and say, you know what, we have these best practices. Are these sufficient? And conversations kind of move through. Not every single vendor engages in nefarious action. There are a lot of good actors in this space. I've happened to work with a number of them, and a number of organizations and a number of companies that are trying to do the right thing and think through these systems and AI governance in the correct way. How do we make that standard? Local government is a great start to do that, because if enough local governments do it, it becomes state. And then if the state does it, then it moves forward. And this is one of the ways, particularly in procurement, where as it goes downstream, particularly for localities, that local governments can lead in this, because again, the liability flows downstream.
No, and that is good. And I think, it does start with organizations such as yourselves, the county of Santa Clara, and others to really think about this. And as Supervisor Simitian said, is that the privacy office here is a forward-leaning privacy office. And those are things that we are thinking about as well, too, is how do we serve our clients and serve them fairly and equitably and provide those services that they need at the end of the day. Let me, we have about 30 minutes left, and we have some pretty good questions that have been provided. And obviously we have some very smart people that are on our panel today. So I'm going to ask some of these questions. I know panelists, you can see some of these as well too, but I'm going to ask any of you to answer them as you feel comfortable. But I want to start with DNA biomarkers as well too. And we know that there's DNA biomarkers that are used for various purposes out there as well too. But how do we make sure, as we're using different biomarkers or other genetics that we're pulling, and I know there's a lot of genetic privacy laws out there as well, how do we make sure AI is using that in a way that is helpful and not maybe punitive? I'll open it up to anyone that wants to try to handle identify how to use that DNA fairly.
Maybe I can make actually a comment on this. When I read the question, I found that it was very interesting, because actually from an EU perspective, the question would be on which ground will you be able to collate and process this biomarker? And of course, it's for law enforcement purposes. It's completely different than for commercial purpose, for example. But all these possibilities that you have in the United States to provide a sample of your DNA to find your origins, it's actually prohibited in Europe. But what is happening is that you've got some European residents that are sending their DNA to US companies. And then we have the question, what is happening with the DNA that they provided? And the question is that, can law enforcement authorities get access to this DNA as well? They were collected for a specific purpose. So if I take a European perspective here, I would say not only you need a specific legal basis, but also a specific purpose, meaning that when you provide information which is considered sensitive, because your DNA is sensitive data, it cannot be easily reused for a different purpose. Having said that, we know that it's happening. But for me, what is interesting is to have a comparison with the US perspective, because I think that DNA seems to be almost like a commodity in the US, or that's how I see it from a European perspective.
Interesting. And the other three panels, I know you're all from the United States. Anything to add or maybe counter?
So I want to uplift Brenda in this moment. I'm working on best practices on HR and AI, and Brenda did a phenomenal job of best practices with biometric information and genetic best practices. And that's at Future Privacy Forum. She led that best practice group, and really that's the standard for best practices that we do at Future Privacy Forum. And I would one, I think it was instituted in law. I cannot remember where. Brenda, please correct me and jump in if you remember exactly where, but like that's how good these best practices were. But one thing I want to kind of note about this, and this is particular for health data, but particular for DNA data, it's consent not just for the individual, but for my family. So when I go and do, so we did, a long time ago, before I really started in privacy work, and I regret this now, I used one of the kind of like family origin sites, right?
Yep.
Without realizing that like, I think my cousin did. And I think it was now my entire family lineage is connected to that site. And so anybody who is if I have children, right, or biological children, they're now connected to that site forever. And that data is there, and it becomes a part of a warehouse. And so our entire family now it can't commit any crimes. And I'm joking, but like our entire family basically is now in this resource database. And
Yeah.
so like, what does that mean? Like, how does a family consent to that? How do you consent for your children in ways if they don't have consent now, right? How is that database accessed, particularly by law enforcement? How broad are they able to do kind of like searches for that DNA? And then lastly, how do you kind of frame up broader conversations around law enforcement access and ensuring that law enforcement are using these kinds of databases in ways that are consistent with our constitutional and civil rights? And that's, I think, something that we should also keep in mind.
It's interesting. I did not think about me opting in, or maybe not being informed and opting in to share my DNA just for genealogy results or something fun. And inadvertently, including my entire family in that tree as well too, and they haven't explicitly opted in as well. Kind of goes back to data specification, data purpose, privacy policy, retention, all another topic for another day. But I think as privacy professionals, we have that obligation to look into what the business is trying to achieve and how do you look at risk, which I think is what we've been thinking about through our whole conversation today. The follow-up question, and maybe Brenda, I'll throw this over to you in this case, is really about data processing from a health perspective, public transportation, connected vehicles, because we know our vehicles now are really driving computers. How do we regulate this type of data, knowing that now AI is going to pick up on this and maybe find that I speed in certain cases, or I drive recklessly, or other information that can be profiled about me that insurance companies or even healthcare can use against me? How do we start thinking about the holistic part of AI and really getting ahead of this as new technology is built?
Again, a lot in that question. First of all, you don't need AI to know who speeds, even at an individual level. And there are a lot of things about our cars now, as you said, they're sort of more like we're driving our computer, and we have interface directly to our phones from them, which adds even more data to the collection there. And so, yes, it is changing very much the space of transportation generally, and turning them into data controllers and data collectors in ways that they never have been in the past. But as with sort of the approach we've taken with many other things in the call today, that's where we need to approach it from. They're now have access to data, or they're setting up systems that create and collect data that didn't exist before, they didn't have before. It's less about, oh, there's AI, what is the AI doing? It's these systems are creating this opportunity, this data that can be used for AI or for other things to track people who are speeding. And what are the controls we need to have on that? What controls are already in place? There are personal data expectations and laws that car manufacturers never had to worry about historically because they didn't have any of that data. Now they do. So they need to know what those laws are and how they may need to consider them. But it's going to be more than just sort of a single, like, oh, and I don't mean to imply that you were saying this, but cars are using AI now, so we sort of have to add on something that says, what do we do about that? every aspect of cars now is changing in ways that reflect the need to consider these systems carefully. So
Yep.
for example, the automated vehicles, not fully automated, but the ones that do like assist driving, stop you before you hit something or help you back into a space or whatever. We're seeing some of the examples of bias that we've talked about earlier in the call today. The first versions of those that were being trained to recognize a person and not run into a person, for example, in a crosswalk, didn't recognize a person who had a cane, because all the data they were trained on, a person has 2 legs, 2 supports. And so if it had 3, it wasn't a person, maybe it was a dog, maybe it was something else, that had a different set of parameters. And I mean, that was an early sort of basic mistake that obviously could be foreseen and corrected, but it's just an example of how many things that we take for granted that we apply generalized knowledge to, that these systems are being asked to do very complex things. And it takes data and it takes trial and it takes, experimentation to get those systems in place. So if we want them, and if we decide those are things that we want to be able to use, we're going to have to find some level of comfort, so to speak, with
Yep.
the fact that we need that data to train those systems and how to get it, which kind of goes back to that health question of people consenting or being aware of how their data is being used further. If we want these systems to work well, they have to have the data to do it. And so we have to find that balance between protecting it at the individual level and making else of it at the de-identified or aggregate level to get some of the benefits of these.
Interesting. Anyone else on the panel would like to chime in? All right.
I want to continue with what Brenda mentioned about the disparate data sets, the aggregation of disparate data sets. That is happening not only in commercial purposes, but we keep also coming back to law enforcement, and as it relates to civil rights, fundamental rights, and discriminatory outcomes. That's one of the major issues for us. So you have access to data sets and information that you otherwise would not legally have access to. So we're also creating workarounds or loopholes or back doors, whatever you want to call it, for this information, finding their ways into law enforcement data sets. Just to follow on one crazy example from, for example, cars, you have data collection systems, algorithmic systems that collect information about how long your car stopped, how long your door was open and closed, at what location, and those data sets are sold to law enforcement as well. So connect that with cameras, connect that with license plate readers, connect that with geofence data. You have a pretty granular information about step-by-step activity there.
Yeah. There's a very interesting question just about ChatGPT, which is all over the internet now, and how ChatGPT has really come to the forefront and how it's being used out there. But one of our participants asked about ChatGPT, OpenAI, and the implications on human jobs, and I'd like to just get the panel's thoughts on, is AI augmenting the workforce, or is it really helping the workforce? I'd like to maybe just get your thoughts on how you've seen AI out there and kind of its impact into the workforce.
So, go ahead, Catherine. Sorry.
Oh, no. You could. No, actually, sorry.
So,
Go
no.
ahead.
These are two issues that I love. So I love ChatGPT. I think it's fun to play with. But it's, and no offense to the folks at OpenAI, I think AI is not as advanced as we think it is. And it's smart for some things, dumb for others, right? So for example, kind of like multifaceted kind of like text AI systems like ChatGPT struggle with math. So for example, there was an article where something happened at CNET. So CNET was using AI to kind of like, I would say, do search engine optimization around particular issues, right? So like, it's like, hey, here's a thing that people are wanting to learn about. We're going to use AI to do search engine optimization so that we show up first and blah, 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 right? But it got compound interest wrong. The AI got compound interest wrong, and it got the math wrong. And so CNET had to actually take it down because it didn't, the chat AI system didn't really understand, the text AI system didn't really understand math that well. And so AI is good for a particular purpose, but not necessarily good at understanding context. It's good for deployment in like minute tasks, right? So if you're asking AI, hey, give me basically all of the contracts that we have that say that have NDAs or particular agreements in them. AI can do that fairly well. It's close to a human, right? But if you're saying, hey, can you show me this particular provision in context with, that's when AI starts really losing its steam, and it's not as good as a human, right? And how it intersects with the workforce is actually really interesting. So one of the things that you're talking about with AI is how are you engaging in kind of like weighting systems that are taking into account like different resumes, right? So HR is hard these days. You need to speed it up. There's a lot of red tape to move it forward. But when you're using AI systems, particularly in the context of employment, are you asking your vendors, or are you using, or are the tools that you're using correct for the thing that you're asking it to do, right? And is it the right tool for the right use case? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. There are HR processes that are phenomenally good for AI, right? Reminders for benefits, like letting people know when to sign up for things, updating certain things, right? But like candidate selection, it's hit or miss. There is a lot of research to say that it is discriminatory, particularly on the recruiting side. And then there's also a lot of research to say that it's more inclusive because people themselves are discriminating. Individuals have to, and government entities have to think through that liability concern itself, right? And themselves, and what risks they are or are not willing to take with particular AI instruments. But there are things that, again, best practices that government entities can require when it comes to their workforce. And there are also things that we can require of these AI systems to ensure that they are non-discriminatory and compliant with the current law, as Brenda says, with Title VII, with the ADA, with the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, right? All of these laws, Pregnant Worker Protection Act, right? We can ensure that like these systems are used in concert with the legal requirements that we all have, and make sure that they are one-to-one. But that's going to take some things because AI is not as smart as we think it is. And so we already have this preconceived notion that AI is right. It's not. And so like when to challenge it and when to use it is always going to be a balancing act.
Great. I'm sorry, I think there was another panelist that was chiming in as well too.
Yes, maybe I can add something as well. ChatGPT, actually, it's a very fascinating topic. And we have been discussing it so at the university in the context of the educational perspective, because some professors or lecturers, they fear that you cannot ask any more questions the way you did previously for the exam, and I think that's true. It has to be more contextualized. I agree with Bertram. If you ask a question and it's just about having knowledge, of course you can use it and you will find the knowledge. But if you ask people to think and to connect different elements, I don't think that ChatGPT will replace what students are supposed to do. That's the same for legal writing or academic writing. If you, of course, just describe a situation, you can use it for that purpose. But if you make a full analysis, I don't think that it can replace human beings. And about replacing humans for jobs, the question is that, is everything AI, or is everything about AI as well? And I don't think that's the case. I know that the county of Santa Clara is in the Silicon Valley, so maybe it's much more relevant where you are than where I'm located, because we don't see everything through the prism of AI, even if we have a lot of AI systems and we will have even more in the future. But we cannot reduce, I think, everything to AI. Well, I hope. And in any case, I don't think that our jobs are going to be replaced by AI, but they could be replaced by people using AI, so being assisted by AI tools.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think we all are naturally suspicious when there is technology out there, and everyone's a little suspicious now of ChatGPT and how is it being used and in what context and how do we change some of our work or our processes to either mitigate some of the negative effects or help with some of the abilities for it to move things forward as well too. The next question is a little complex, and I want to ask, and again, I can open up to maybe Bertram, you can start with this because it's asking me about Title VI. But looking at longitudinal data, AI, and linking to data to individuals, and the question is, what are the risks or harms of blockchain, longitudinal AI, and the type of AI that's integrated into the cradle to grave data systems, meaning using blockchain or systems that permanently connect to individuals? Is this a problem, and what are those? And what do you think some of the harms are in the public sector, and specifically to children, as we are using this data maybe in a public-private partnership?
This is me, Bertram Lee, not on behalf of Future Privacy Forums. I'm not the biggest fan of blockchain for a number of reasons. In certain use cases, absolutely. Like I think blockchain could be used in copyright. That's phenomenal because like those things are kind of like it's easier to segment those systems. But when it comes to individuals, it's a little bit hard because access, correction, and deletion become almost impossible in certain contexts with blockchain. And so I think there are a couple things that like I would keep in mind with kind of blockchain technologies, in particular, like using AI systems in particular around children is that one, there's no way to consent, right? Reasonably consent in those circumstances. Two, you can't contract with children, right? So that's illegal. And even the contract with parents, depending on the context, for example, there was a clause in the proposed federal privacy law that would have made it illegal, or like would have made arbitration clauses for parents who signed off on their children's data on behalf of the children non-enforceable within that context as a private right of action. And so that's, I think, interesting because, like, again, there are significant legal issues that at bay. I think one of the things that you want to keep in mind is how data is stored, where it's stored, how it is accessed, can it be corrected when wrong, right? And can it be changed? So for example, when you're talking about a baby and then maybe they decide, or maybe they are non-binary or are trans, right? Then that changes the context of how that data is kind of like understood, right? And then there are lots of changes that we go through in society, right? What if you as a child are kind of like taken into a system and then there's a juvenile, so example, using blockchain in the juvenile justice system would be a non-starter, I think, for a lot of people, because there's a chance for expungement. What you did as a child should not be defining you as an adult, and how those systems and how that data is used is like disconcerting, because if I was judged on the decisions that I made right now as a 12-year-old, and that data was a part of me and carried with me forever, like there would be significant concerns. I mean, we all would. We were different people. We're different people than we were 5 years ago, let alone 20 plus years ago, right? So I think those are things to keep in mind about like how AI systems kind of work within that kind of like longitudinal range, about like keeping data for incredibly long periods of time. Governments do it all the time, but they're sealed. And there are also protections that the individual has with that data we should be thinking about that for AI systems as well, right? Again, what is the use case? What are we using it for, right? What is the context of that data? What are some potential future harms that can come from that? NIST AI risk management framework is a great place to start with that. And so like, that's, I think, one of the places and one of the things that I think we want to use AI to solve a lot of our problems, but like actually like, we should be thinking about how to solve those problems. And then what is the most narrow use that we can use AI for in those contexts? I don't know if that answers the question, but that's at least my best attempt.
No, I appreciate that. How about any of the other panelists? It's a complex question.
I want to jump in with the cradle to grave piece, not so much on the blockchain, because I'm like Bertram, I'm not a big fan. We have systems, like one is the accuracy of the information that we're collecting on people or individuals and what those profiles look like, how do they change over time. But also AI systems do not imagine a future or cannot imagine the opportunities or different things that are not already in the data set. So you're stuck with the past behavior, past trends, what you have done, and judged accordingly. You know, you're judged by your past, not so much about your future. Just as Bertram said, you know, you're not. We don't talk about aspirations. We don't talk about second chances. We don't talk about development and changes, etc. Chris Gillard has an amazing article on this that I strongly recommend to anyone interested in this, about being stuck in the past, you know, for AI systems forcing us to be stuck in the past and criminalizing some of our actions.
Wow.
We go back to our teenage years. If you're judged by what you've done in your teenage years and in college, etc., a good proportion of us would not be, you know, here today or talking about the things like we believe in development, we believe in, you know, aspirations, we believe in development goals, right? So if you have systems that follow you from cradle to grave and, you know, subject you, profile you, assess your risk, your trustworthiness, your creditworthiness, your employability, etc., then we're in serious trouble. And second piece is around governance, especially on children. New York has apparently has a practice that is getting a lot of pushback right now, taking heel prick blood tests from newborns. So asking the parents to sign a consent form at the point of birth when you're most stressed.
Yeah.
And they use the blood for rare disease checks, which is a great thing, but then keep the dry samples in a database that is then shared with researchers or other third parties. So we talked about, you know, genetic tests and not only consenting for your family downstream and upstream, you're also consenting at the point, like at that point, you have given away DNA data for your grandchildren, great-grandchildren that are not even born yet, let alone too young to consent. So
yeah,
I think as governments, as states, federal or local governments, even county governments need to look at our practices and really think about what does that mean for this person's life opportunities, access to resources and fundamental rights at the end of the day.
yeah. I really appreciate how you and Bertram also looked at the past should not be the predictor of the future. And we really need to be looking at the potential of the individual versus maybe some of the past practices or decisions that that person may have not made. And I do agree with you. If you did judge me on what I did as a teenager, I probably would not be in this chair today as well. So I'm fortunate that that didn't carry with me. The last question I want to ask is really to our attorneys is looking at attorney knowledge in this area as well. And in the two questions that are in our chat is what role do attorneys play in driving good AI practice? And what is your level as an attorney? What are some of your concerns given the AI knowledge gap within the legal community? Which one of our attorneys would like to take that?
I'll jump in first on that since that's literally the whole point of my law firm. is to deal with AI issues and to be partnered not only with other lawyers who know AI, but with literally with computer scientists, so that we don't miss anything from a technical perspective as well, since that's not our training as lawyers. And we actually are seeing that in many cases, it's other law firms that are sometimes coming to us with a client that they are providing a service to and saying a part of that service or part of what that need is to, involves AI in some way, overseeing a system, developing policies, whatever it might be. And so they will pull us in as a of counsel addition to that account to provide that very specialized service. So obviously we are one firm. We wouldn't be able to do that for everyone, endlessly, and more such firms will start, but we are seeing firms, growing their own AI practices. Just as 20 years ago, no firms had a privacy practice, and now pretty much all firms do. And they will eventually catch up, or they will start to. But in the meantime, most responsible attorneys understand their own limitations, what they do and what they don't know. And so, they either partner with other firms, or they bring in people with those specialties, or they begin to develop them themselves for their team. But I do agree that in the short run, this is going to be something that's challenging to have enough resources for the amount of technology that's growing and applying generally.
Yeah.
Chris, can I take a quick second to uplift
course.
Brenda and Merv and Catherine and their leadership in this space, and particularly Brenda, who's, again, shoes I'm filling at FPF, and her leadership and her ability, and the fact that she was really leading in this space well before this became an issue, before we were even talking about AI bias, before we were talking about NIST responsible risk management frameworks. Brenda was doing this work at FPF, and I'm really trying to build off of this work. And so she's going to probably blush and be way too embarrassed to say this, but I was embarrassed that I'm even saying this, but this is something that she has been working on for years and has really led. And so as she's talking about this and her work in her firm, this is a way to uplift that work, because she knows what she's talking about. She's been doing this with companies for years and with government agencies as well. So I just wanted to take a quick moment to kind of uplift her in this moment, because I think she often does not get enough credit for her leadership.
I appreciate that. And I also have to extend the same thing to the county's privacy office. This is being an area of concern before I came here as being the appointed chief privacy officer in December. And obviously this is something that we're looking at in making sure that we understand it and its uses as well too. But as we wrap up, we have about 7 minutes left. I want to ask each of you this concluding question. What is the one recommendation that you would provide an organization if they're considering to use AI? And I know that's a tough question because I'm asking you just one recommendation. So maybe I'll start with Catherine first and move over to Merv, Brenda, and then Bertram.
Indeed, one recommendation. Well, is it an AI system necessary? And if so, you should do an impact assessment to assess how it could negatively affect people. I think that's the advice that I will give, an impact assessment.
And I would recommend, especially if you're procuring AI systems, and that goes for county, city, state, federal level, as well as private companies, do proper due diligence that is specific to AI and AI specific risks and challenges. And I think that includes a lot of the governance questions that we talked about, and a lot of the questions that we've been asking today as well. So do proper due diligence.
Great.
I think, very, very much the same as those 2 points, but just recognize that if you're doing something that uses some sort of AI machine learning process as part of what you're doing, procuring, applying, that's going to require some specialized knowledge, and either, consult with people or get some training, or, do the things in order to do an impact assessment or whatever those might be. But sort of just recognize that this is probably a unique situation you haven't faced before, and that you do need additional resources of some kind to guide you through all of these very, logical recommended steps.
Yeah.
I would say there's a distinction between private actors and public actors. For private actors, really set up a risk management framework. The NIST framework is a great place to start from, but there are a number of other frameworks that are also effective, but some sort of framework for your own liability purposes is incredibly important, because if your AI is found to be discriminatory or you get in some big public trouble, you want to be able to track your steps as to how you reach certain decisions and be able to ensure that you engaged in a thoughtful process moving forward, because judges take that into account. For public sector actors, think about what your procurement practices look like. What are the requirements that public sector people use on the front end with their contractors? What are some things, the language that you can put in to ensure that you are also engaging in some sort of protecting your own liability, protecting the county from liability? Are there impact assessments that you're requiring? Are you requiring independent audits? Are you requiring some sort of adherence to a risk management framework to be double checked by the county? It's sometimes uncertain, right? How are you ensuring that people are following through with the requirements that you need to follow through with in order to limit liability moving forward? Those would be my two big recommendations for both public and private actors.
Great. Well, I think the panelists today, I think we could probably go on all afternoon or all evening regarding just AI in general. And I know there's several questions we did not get to, and we will work on getting those answered and get those distributed or posted on our public privacy website. But I wanted to, again, thank our panelists. I want to thank our technical services team, the privacy office today for coming together and having this discussion. And again, on behalf of the County of Santa Clara's Privacy Office and the Office of County Supervisor Joe Simitian, I hope everyone enjoyed today's event. We have a short anonymous survey that we will be sending out afterwards. We love your candid feedback. And special thanks again to the four panelists that really got us to think about and rethink about where we are with AI and how do we use it responsibly, both in the private and public sector. And we look forward to having you join us again in the future. So thank you so much for your time, and please stay safe.